The envelope had no return address, only the faint smell of street smoke and the weight of a secret 40 years old. Manny Pacquiao stood alone in his mansion's marble hallway, his calloused fighter's hands trembling as he pulled out a faded photograph of a young woman whose eyes mirrored his own. Below the image, scrawled in desperate and handwriting, were words that would shatter everything he thought he knew. Your real mother never stopped loving you. She's alive, homeless, and selling cigarettes in Divisoria. The letter slipped from his fingers, floating to the floor like a leaf falling from a tree he'd climbed as a barefoot child. His wife's voice called from another room, asking if everything was okay. But Manny couldn't answer because the ground beneath his feet had suddenly become water. He picked up the photograph again, studying the scar on the woman's left hand. A detail so specific it couldn't be a cruel joke. The anonymous sender had included an address, a corner near the old market where poverty still wore. The same face it had when he'd escaped it decades ago. That night, sleep refused to come, as Manny lay staring at the ceiling fan spinning lazy circles above his bed. His mind kept returning to the woman who raised him, the mother he'd built houses for and showered with everything his championship purses could buy. But now, questions he'd buried, since childhood, clawed their way back to the surface like fighters refusing to stay down. He remembered asking about his birth, about baby photos that never existed, about relatives who changed the subject with nervous laughter. His mother, the woman he called Mother, had always deflected with stories that shifted like shadows, depending on who was listening. The photograph on his nightstand seemed to glow in the darkness, those familiar eyes staring at him across decades of separation. Before dawn broke over Manila, Manny had made his decision. He would go to Divisoria alone, without bodyguards or cameras, just a son searching for a truth that might destroy him or finally make him whole. The streets of Divisoria swallowed Manny whole as he stepped from his unmarked sedan into the crush of vendors, tricycles, and smoke from grilling meat that hung in the air like memories made visible. He wore a baseball cap pulled low and sunglasses despite the overcast sky, becoming invisible in the very poverty he'd once inhabited like a second skin. The address led him deeper into narrow corridors where laundry hung between buildings like flags of surrender, where children played in puddles that reflected nothing but grey sky. His heart hammered against his ribs with the same intensity as the 12th round of any championship fight, but this opponent was truth itself. Then he saw her, perched on a wooden stool at a corner where two alleys met, cigarettes displayed on a cardboard tray, her weathered hands counting coins with the precision of someone for whom every peso meant survival. Her profile stopped him mid-step because it was his own face aged by decades and hardship, the same angular jaw, the same slope of the nose that cameras had captured 1,000,000 times. Manny approached slowly, his legs feeling heavy as if wading through deep water, and studied her hands as she sold a pack of Marlboros to a teenager who didn't look twice at her face. There it was, exactly as the letter described. A curved scar on her left hand, white against brown skin, shaped like a crescent. Munora's smile turned sideways. The woman counted her money with fingers that trembled slightly, arthritis or age, or simply the weight of a life lived on concrete and broken dreams. He stood 3 feet away, close enough to hear her raspy breathing, close enough to see his own eyes looking out from her worn face. When she finally glanced up at him, there was no recognition, only the weary assessment of a potential customer, another faceless person in the river of humanity that flowed past her corner every single day. Her voice cracked like dried leather when she spoke, asking what he needed. And Manny heard in that voice every lullaby he'd never received, every birthday wish she'd whispered to empty air. He removed his sunglasses slowly, his hands shaking worse than they ever had before any fight, and watched her face for any flicker of recognition that refused to come. Instead, she squinted at him with confusion, perhaps wondering why this stranger stared at her with such intensity, why tears gathered in his eyes behind the famous face. She didn't connect to the infant she'd surrendered. Manny knelt down on the filthy pavement beside her stool, ignoring the dirt that stained his jeans, bringing himself to her eye level as he'd done countless times with street children he'd helped throughout the years. His voice barely rose above a whisper when he asked her name, and when she answered, the world seemed to stop spinning for just one eternal moment. Her name fell from cracked lips like a prayer finally answered, Dionysia Mercado. And with it came a story that had lived inside her for 40 years like a second heartbeat. She spoke slowly at first, her eyes drifting past Manny toward memories only she could see. Her hands still absently arranging cigarette packs as if the motion itself kept her tethered to reality. The words tumbled out in Tagalog, raw and unpolished, about a different Manila, a hungrier one, where she'd given birth in a charity hospital with walls that wept moisture and hallways that smelled of disinfectant, trying to mask despair. Her sister had been there, younger and married to a man with steady work, while she had nothing but empty pockets and a studio apartment she shared with 4 other families, separated only by hanging sheets. The baby had come early, small but screaming with lungs that demanded a future she couldn't provide, and she'd held him for 3 days before her sister made the offer that would split her soul in 2. She described holding that infant against her chest, memorizing the weight of him, the smell of his hair, the way his tiny fist gripped her finger with strength that mocked her weakness. The decision hadn't been sudden but inevitable, like watching floodwaters rise and knowing you cannot stop them. Only choose what you'll try to save. Her sister promised education, food, safety, all the things love alone couldn't manufacture from nothing. And she'd signed papers in a municipal office where the clerk had yawned through her heartbreak. She told Manny how she'd kissed her son's forehead one final time, how she'd pressed her scarred hand against his chest to feel his heartbeat, how she'd walked out of that hospital with empty arms and breasts that ached with milk, meant for a child who would never know her name. For 40 years, she'd carried that moment like a stone in her chest, working every job Manila offered its invisible women, sending anonymous money when she could to her sister. Never asking, never visiting, keeping her distance because the agreement had been complete separation. Her voice broke when she described watching other mothers with their sons, how every boy in every crowd became the phantom of what she'd surrendered, how poverty had forced her to choose his life over her own happiness. She looked directly at Manny then, this stranger who listened with tears streaming down his face and said the words that had haunted her every single day. She'd been too poor to be a mother, but never poor enough to stop being one in her heart. The cigarette smoke curled between them like incense in a church, where confession came 40 years too late and forgiveness remained uncertain. She asked why he wanted to know such an old and painful story, what interest a well-dressed man could possibly have in the failures of a woman the world had long ago stopped seeing. Manny's hands trembled as he reached toward her, decades of questions finally finding their terrible, beautiful answers in the face of the woman who'd loved him enough to let him go. The cigarette vendor fell silent, her confession hanging in the humid air between them like something sacred and unbearable. Manny felt his knees weaken as the truth rewired every memory he'd ever held about himself, transforming his entire existence into something both more painful and more beautiful than he'd imagined. The street noise around them, jeepneys honking, vendors shouting, the chaos of Divisoria faded into a distant hum as he stared at this woman, whose eyes reflected his own back at him across 4 decades of separation. His voice came out fractured, barely above a whisper, as he said the words that would change both their lives forever. "I am Manny Pacquiao, and I think I am your son." The cigarette pack she'd been holding slipped from her fingers, scattering across the cracked pavement like fallen prayers. Her mouth opened, but no sound emerged, her scarred hand rising to her chest as if to keep her heart from escaping. Time seemed to collapse on itself as recognition and impossibility warred across her weathered face. She shook her head violently, denying what her eyes were confirming, her body swaying as if the earth itself had become unreliable beneath her feet. Hindi possible, she gasped, the words catching in her throat like broken glass. But Manny was already reaching for his wallet, pulling out his identification card, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped it. She stared at the photo, at the name, then back at the man before her, the world champion she'd watched from stadium shadows, the senator, the hero of the Filipino people. And the impossibility became undeniable reality. Her legs buckled and Manny caught her, both of them sinking to the filthy sidewalk as 40 years of separation shattered in a single moment. Around them, curious onlookers began to gather, sensing something extraordinary unfolding in their ordinary street. She clutched his arms with surprising strength, her fingers tracing his face as if reading scripture written in flesh and bone. Through sobs that shook her entire body, she reached into her worn dress and pulled out a small cloth bundle, tied with string that had been retied thousands of times. Her trembling fingers unwrapped it with ceremonial care, revealing a tiny hospital bracelet yellowed with age, the ink faded but still legible. Baby boy Mercado, with a date that matched his birthday. I kept it, she whispered, her voice breaking on every syllable. Every day I carried you with me, even when I had nothing else. Manny took the bracelet with reverence, this fragment of his beginning, proof that he'd been loved even in the act of letting go. The gathering crowd pressed closer now, phones emerging as recognition rippled through. Them, the people's champion kneeling in the dirt with a cigarette vendor who held the truth of his origins in her scarred hands. The hospital bracelet lay across Manny's palm like a relic from another lifetime, the fragile plastic impossibly light, yet carrying the weight of 4 decades. His thumb traced the faded letters of a name he'd never known. Was his. The proof that he'd existed to someone before he became a champion, before he became a senator, before he became a symbol of hope to millions. Tears streamed freely down his face now, each one carrying years of unknowing, of incomplete identity, of a hollowness he'd filled with victories but never fully understood. The woman before, him, his mother, his blood, his origin, wept with such abandon that her entire body convulsed, her hands still reaching for him as if afraid he might vanish like smoke. Around them, the crowd of onlookers had grown silent, witnessing something so raw and sacred that even the most jaded street vendors felt their own eyes burning. Somewhere in that gathering, multiple phones captured the moment, recording the impossible scene of the nation's hero broken open by love on a garbage-strewn sidewalk. The footage would leak within hours, spreading across social media like wildfire. But in that moment, none of it mattered except the truth passing between mother and son. "You came to my fights," Manny whispered, the revelation hitting him with fresh devastation as he remembered all those sold-out arenas, the deafening crowds, never knowing she was there. His mother nodded frantically, her scarred hands clutching his designer shirt as if holding on to life itself, leaving smudges of street dirt across the expensive fabric that somehow made it more valuable than before. "Every single one I could reach," she sobbed, her voice hoarse with decades of silent prayers and survival. "From the cheapest seats, from outside when I had no money for tickets, from televisions in store windows, I watched my son become everything I dreamed while I remained nothing." The words shattered something fundamental in Manny's chest, the image of her straining to see him through crowds and distance while he'd searched every face for validation without knowing the one that mattered most was hidden in shadows. He pulled her fully into his embrace, this woman who'd carried his beginning in a cloth bundle through countless nights of hunger and danger. who'd never stopped being his mother even when the world didn't know. The street around them blurred into insignificance as Manny held her tighter, feeling her heartbeat against his chest, the same rhythm that had lulled him to sleep before memory began. The video reached 10 million views before Manny had even left Divisoria, the algorithm, treating human desperation as content, transforming sacred reunion into viral commodity. Within hours, the Philippines fractured along invisible fault lines as the footage spread, some weeping at their screens, moved by the purest expression of maternal love and filial devotion they'd ever witnessed. Others sharpened their judgment like knives, flooding comment sections with questions that cut deeper than any punch Manny had ever absorbed in the ring. Why didn't she search for him when he became famous? They typed with righteous fury, their fingers passing verdict on choices made in circumstances they'd never endured. She could have found him years ago. She just wants his money now. The accusations multiplied, poisoning the miracle with suspicion. Talk shows booked segments within the hour, inviting psychologists and social commentators to dissect a mother's pain for ratings, to debate whether poverty excused abandonment or made it unforgivable. The nation that had claimed Manny as their son now questioned whether he belonged to a woman who'd sold cigarettes while he won world titles, whether blood meant anything against the mother who'd actually raised him. In his convoy racing back toward Manila proper, Manny sat beside the woman whose existence rewrote his entire history, his security team nervous about the unvetted stranger now under their protection. His phone buzzed incessantly with calls from managers, publicists, political advisors, all demanding he release a statement, control the narrative before it controlled him, protect his brand from the controversy blooming like toxic flowers across every platform. But Manny couldn't hear their panic over the sound of his mother's breathing, still uneven from crying, still disbelieving that the child she'd surrendered was sitting beside her in leather seats she'd never imagined existed. She stared at her hands in her lap, those scarred and weathered instruments of survival, suddenly ashamed of their appearance next to his manicured fighter's hands. "They're saying terrible things about me already." "Aren't they?" she whispered, her voice carrying the particular resignation of someone who'd long ago accepted she deserved whatever cruelty the world offered. Manny took those damaged hands in his, feeling the calluses that told stories of every peso earned through dignity when surrender would have been easier. "Let them talk," he said with the calm that preceded his most devastating combinations. "They don't know what survival costs when you have nothing but love." The convoy pulled through the gates of his Forbes Park mansion, the sprawling symbol of everything poverty had told him he could never achieve, now about to host the woman who'd ensured his survival by disappearing. Inside, his adoptive mother, the woman who'd fed him, raised him, loved him through every hunger and hardship, stood frozen in the marble foyer, her face collapsing as she saw her sister after 4 decades of separation and secrets. The two women stared across the impossible distance of polished floors and crystal chandeliers, both knowing this moment would either heal or destroy what remained of their fractured family. Manny's adoptive mother aged visibly in those seconds, her shoulders curving under the weight of confession she'd carried since he was too young to remember. "I'm sorry," she choked out, the words barely audible but carrying enough force to crack the careful life she'd built on. Necessary lies. "I'm sorry I took him. Sorry I never told you he asked about you. Sorry I let you suffer thinking he forgot." Her voice shattered completely as his biological mother crossed the distance between them, not with accusation, but with outstretched arms. "You saved him," his birth mother sobbed, embracing the sister who'd taken her. "Greatest sacrifice, and transformed it into miracle. Who turned her loss into the nation's champion. You gave him everything I couldn't. You made him into this." The reunion between sisters carried different weight than the street discovery. This one acknowledging that love sometimes means releasing what you die to keep, that motherhood exists in forms beyond biology. Manny stood watching both women hold each other and weep for all the years that poverty and pride had stolen, understanding finally that he hadn't been abandoned, but loved by hearts that broke themselves open to ensure his survival. Outside the mansion walls, the nation continued its debate, dividing his miracle into camps of forgiveness and condemnation. But inside these walls, three people who'd paid different prices for the same love began the harder work of becoming whole. The three of them sat in Manny's private study as afternoon light filtered through windows that overlooked a city where both mothers had once struggled to find their next meal. His adoptive mother's hands trembled as she poured tea into porcelain cups worth more than she'd earned in entire years of her youth, the delicate china feeling obscene against memories of sharing one cracked glass between hungry children. She had rehearsed this confession countless times in her mind during sleepless nights when success made their old poverty feel like fiction, but now the words lodged in her throat like stones. Manny reached across the mahogany table and steadied her shaking hand, his touch permission to finally exhale 4 decades of truth. "Tell me everything," he said softly, his voice carrying no accusation, only the need to understand the architecture of sacrifice that had built his life. His birth mother sat silent, her weathered face composed with the patience learned from years when waiting was the only power she possessed. The study filled with the weight of approaching revelation, 3 hearts beating different rhythms of the same ancient pain. "Your mother came to me with nothing but you wrapped in newspaper," his adoptive mother began, her voice breaking on words that had lived too long in darkness. "She was bleeding still from the birth, so weak she could barely stand. But she carried you 12 kilometers because she knew I had just lost my own baby." The confession spilled faster now, grief refreshing itself across the decades. "I was drowning in my own emptiness when she arrived, and she looked at me with such desperate hope. She said, 'Save him, because I can only watch him die.'" Tears carved paths through makeup that usually hid the years of hardship her success could never quite erase. "I took you that night and she disappeared before dawn, leaving only a note that said, 'Tell him his mother loved him enough to become a ghost.'" His biological mother spoke then, her voice rough as the streets that had shaped her survival. "I came back once when you were 5 years old, hid across the street just to see you playing, wearing clean clothes and laughing. Sounds I could never have given you." She pressed, weathered, her palms against her eyes, as if to push the memory back inside where it had lived so long. "Your mother saw me there and came outside. And instead of anger, she thanked me, said you were brilliant and strong and hungry for life itself." The words carried wonder even now, as if kindness remained the greatest shock she'd ever absorbed. "She begged me not to confuse you, said you were thriving and my return would only plant questions in soil that was finally growing something beautiful." Her shoulders curved inward with the permanent posture of someone who'd made herself small enough to disappear. "So I loved you from a distance, trading my presence for your peace." Manny rose and stood between both women, placing one hand on each of their shoulders, forming a trinity of sacrifice and survival that embodied every Filipino family who'd ever chosen hunger over their children's suffering. "You both mothered me with different kinds of courage," he said, his voice carrying the strength that had made him champion of the world, and now champion of a harder truth. "One of you fed my body when you had nothing, the other fed my future by surrendering everything. I am the son of 2 women who loved me enough to break their own hearts." He knelt before them both, this man who'd never bowed to any opponent, humbling himself before the only victories that mattered. The afternoon sun gilded 3 figures joined finally in truth, poverty's cruelest division, beginning its long journey toward healing. Outside these walls, his nation argued about worthiness and forgiveness. But inside, Manny Pacquiao honored the mothers who'd turned deprivation into devotion, proving that the Filipino spirit transforms even abandonment into the most profound act of love. The press conference took place not in some sterile hotel ballroom, but in the very Divisoria streets, where destiny had reunited them. Manny transforming public spectacle into public sermon about the family's poverty forced to fracture. Hundreds gathered as he stood between both mothers on a makeshift stage built from the same wooden pallets that street vendors used to display their desperate merchandise, the symbolism deliberate and devastating. Television cameras from 17 nations focused on three figures whose combined story contained the DNA of every Filipino family scattered across the world by economic exile. These women taught me that survival sometimes wears the mask of abandonment. Manny began, his voice amplified through speakers, but needing no technology to carry the weight of conviction that had always defined him. They show us that the mother who stays and the mother who leaves can both be performing the same act of love. His biological mother gripped his hand with fingers that still smelled of the cigarettes she'd sold that very morning, unable to surrender her identity even as rescue arrived. His adoptive mother stood tall for the first time in weeks, released finally from the prison of her beautiful lie. Today, I announce the Dalawang Ina Foundation, Two Mothers Foundation, dedicated to reuniting families that poverty has torn apart and supporting parents forced to choose between presence and survival. The crowd erupted not in polite applause, but in the raw collective sob of a nation that understood this pain in their bones, in their empty chairs at dinner tables, in their children raised by video calls from other countries. Manny continued as his mothers stood flanking him like pillars supporting the temple of his purpose, their weathered faces projected on screens across Manila. We will provide housing, job training, and family counseling, because no parent should have to ghost their own child to save them. No child should prosper while wondering if they were ever truly wanted. His voice cracked on words that carried his own bewilderment, transformed into mission, personal wound becoming national healing. Bills and coins rained onto the stage as vendors and drivers and maids threw what little they had toward a dream that honored their own impossible choices. The champion who'd conquered every ring now fought his greatest opponent, the savage mathematics of deprivation that calculated love in terms of absence. Television crews captured the moment both mothers embraced, while Manny stood behind them, his hands on their shoulders, creating an image that would define his legacy beyond any belt or trophy. Reporters shouted questions about blame and abandonment, but Manny silenced them with a look that had intimidated opponents twice his size, protective of the women who'd constructed his life from their own demolition. There are no villains in this story, only heroes who bled in different ways, he declared, his words cutting through the noise of judgment that Filipinos had learned to expect from a world that rarely understood their particular species of sacrifice. His biological mother pulled from her pocket the stack of ticket stubs she'd kept, holding them high so cameras could document her 40 years of faithful witness from the furthest, cheapest seats. She was always there, Manny said, his voice breaking finally, the invincible fighter revealing the abandoned boy still living. Inside his championship body, the foundation launched that day with donations flooding in from overseas workers who saw their own fractured families reflected in this trinity of redemption. The streets of Divisoria became holy ground, where poverty's cruelest arithmetic was finally rewritten into an equation where love equaled presence plus absence, where both mothers could equal one whole truth. The revelation came not through words, but through evidence. When his biological mother returned from Manny's guest room carrying a battered suitcase held together with fraying rope that had survived countless rainy seasons on Manila's unforgiving streets. Her hands trembled as she untied knots she'd secured and released 1,000 times, each opening a ritual of remembrance that had sustained her through decades of deliberate invisibility. Inside lay the archaeology of her devotion. Ticket stubs arranged chronologically from his first professional fight to his most recent defense, each one purchased with money that should have fed her for days. Newspapers yellow with age documented every victory in words she'd taught herself to read, just to understand the articles about her son, her literacy born from maternal hunger stronger than any educational system. Photographs clipped from magazines showed Manny's evolution from hungry prospect to global icon, her collection more comprehensive than any official archive because it was curated by love rather than professional obligation. She spread these relics across his marble floor like sacred texts, transforming his mansion into a museum of her faithful witness from the shadows. "I was there when you fought in that gymnasium with only 200 people watching," she whispered, pointing to a stub so faded the ink had nearly surrendered to time's erosion. "I sat in the back row, where the metal chairs had rust that stained my only dress. But I didn't care, because I could see you moving like lightning even then." Her finger traced the progression through venues that grew larger as his fame expanded, her seats growing cheaper and further away as ticket prices climbed beyond her cigarette-selling economics. Manny knelt beside her as she narrated this parallel career of attendance, his own memories of those fights now haunted by the knowledge that somewhere in those anonymous crowds his mother had been silently celebrating every punch he threw. Even for the international fights, "I found ways," she continued, showing him tickets to public viewings in plazas where giant screens broadcast his matches to thousands who couldn't afford pay-per-view. "I would arrive 6 hours early to stand close enough to really see your face when they announced your name." The ticket from his fight against Mexico's greatest champion still bore her thumbprint in dried blood, where she'd gripped it so hard during the final round that her fingernails broke through skin. "I bled with you that night," she said simply, the statement containing volumes about the phantom pain mothers carry for children they cannot claim publicly. Manny lifted that particular stub, with the reverence usually reserved for religious relics, understanding now that he'd never fought alone in any ring. His adoptive mother joined them on the floor, examining these documents of her sister's secret devotion, tears falling onto newspaper clippings that reported victories she'd celebrated openly, while her sister celebrated in strategic silence. The two women began comparing memories of specific fights, their perspectives from opposite ends of economic reality, creating a stereo narrative of his career that was finally, mercifully complete. "We both watched you become everything we dreamed," his adoptive mother said, taking her sister's scarred hand in her own. Manny understood then that these tickets and clippings weren't just souvenirs, but proof of presence. His biological mother's way of mothering from the margins, her love expressed through witness when expression through embrace was impossible. "You carried me to every fight," he said, gathering both mothers into his arms, the champion finally. Understanding that victory had always been a family effort, transcending blood and circumstance. The community center rose from Divisoria's concrete like a cathedral built not for worship, but for restoration. Its walls painted in colors that defied the grey fatalism of poverty surrounding it. Manny stood between both mothers as they unveiled the bronze plaque bearing their names in equal prominence, neither woman elevated above the other, because sacrifice cannot be measured in hierarchies when survival itself demanded impossible choices from the powerless. Hundreds of families who'd lived invisible in Manila's shadows gathered to witness this consecration of a space designed specifically for their dignity, Former street vendors and separated parents, seeing their own fractured histories reflected in the champion's willingness to transform private pain into public healing. The building stood on the exact corner where he'd found her selling cigarettes, the geographic precision deliberate, marking the spot where abandonment transformed into reunion and where shame converted into sanctuary. Television cameras broadcast the ceremony across archipelagic distances, every island receiving the same message that fractured families could find wholeness and that poverty's humiliations need not define permanence. Manny's speech acknowledged what everyone already understood, that his fists had won championships, but his mother's resilience had won something greater, the victory of endurance over circumstances designed to destroy the human spirit's capacity for hope. The Foundation's first initiative reunited 12 families separated by economic desperation, similar to what had divided his own bloodline. Their tearful embraces playing out in the center's courtyard, like echoes of his personal redemption, multiplied through institutional compassion. Both mothers worked there daily despite Manny's offers of comfortable retirement, their presence transforming the center from charitable concept into living testimony that women who'd survived impossible decisions could guide others through similar valleys. His biological mother led support groups for homeless parents, her ticket stub collection displayed in glass cases as evidence that witness constitutes its own form of parenthood when physical proximity becomes impossible. His adoptive mother managed family counseling services, her experience raising a champion despite resource scarcity, qualifying her to advise others that limitation need not extinguish aspiration. The sisters worked side by side in offices separated only by a shared wall, their partnership finally public after decades of secret collaboration to raise a son who'd become the nation's embodiment of transformation possible when love transcends conventional boundaries. The Philippines watched its champion evolve from fighter to healer, his transition symbolizing the nation's own journey from colonial subjugation to sovereign dignity, both requiring generations of perseverance against forces designed to enforce permanent subordination. Manny's willingness to publicly honor complicated family truth rather than maintain comfortable fiction resonated across a culture built on similar contradictions, where survival often demanded choices that prosperity later allowed people to judge from positions of comfortable moral superiority. The center became pilgrimage site for those carrying their own secrets of sacrifice, parents who'd made devastating decisions finding absolution in a space that refused simplistic narratives about good mothers and bad mothers, understanding instead that poverty itself was the villain in stories where women did impossible mathematics with insufficient resources. His biological mother's ticket stubs became national metaphor for all. The invisible ways the marginalized participate in celebrations from which economic reality excludes them, their presence unacknowledged, but their investment absolute. Documentary crews recorded daily operations as the center expanded services beyond family reunification into job training and housing assistance, Manny's boxing fortune converting into infrastructure for dignity restoration among populations previously considered beyond due redemption's reach. The story concluded not with an ending, but with a beginning. The center's doors opening each morning to receive new families seeking repair of what poverty had fractured, their healing made possible by a champion who'd transformed personal wound into collective medicine. Both mothers greeted arrivals together, their partnership visible proof that reconciliation transcends simple forgiveness to become active collaboration in preventing others from enduring similar separations. Manny continued fighting professionally, but his real battles now occurred in policy meetings where he advocated for systemic protections, preventing economic desperation from forcing parents into impossible surrenders of their children. The Philippines recognized in his journey their own national narrative of resilience against forces that sought to permanently diminish them. His refusal to be defined by origins reflecting their collective insistence on self-determination, despite centuries of others writing their story. The community center stood as monument not just to individual redemption, but to the possibility that nations like people can transform historical trauma into foundations for building futures where such trauma no longer replicates itself across generations. What impossible choice would you make to protect someone you love? Subscribe to witness more stories where pain transforms into purpose and brokenness becomes the blueprint for building something beautiful.